And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul. Sonja Cherry-Paul is the founder of Red Clay Educators, co-director of the Institute for Racial Equity and Literacy, co-director of the Teach Black History All Year Institute, and executive producer and host of the Black Creators Series. She's an educator with more than 20 years of classroom experience and who has written several books that support reading and writing instruction and has adapted the #1 New York Times bestseller, Stamped, for Kids. Sonja leads professional development for schools and organizations in equity and anti-racism. Her newest title, Antiracist Reading Revolution, will be publishing in 2 weeks on May 28th, and it is the focus of today's webinar. And now I will turn this over to Sonja Cherry-Paul so we can get started. Welcome, Sonja.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you to the entire Corwin team. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited that you are here, and we're going to jump in and get started because I have an ambitious plan for us today. So thanks for firing up the chat. I'm going to ask you to continue to do that work, starting right now. When you think of a dandelion, what words and images come to mind? Go ahead and share your thinking in the chat. When you think of a dandelion, what comes to mind? Beautiful. Wishes, weed. Yeah. Beautiful. Resilient. I love it. I love that you all have such really powerful, beautiful connotations with dandelions. Now, what words and images come to mind when you think of anti-racism? Share some of those ideas in the chat. Oh, I love that Elizabeth starts with love, kindness, hope. Someone saying sad and dark. Okay. Powerful, equity, caring. Yeah. So unlike this incredible audience that's here tonight virtually, there can be a lot of negative connotations associated with dandelions, right? And I think that dandelions and anti-racism have a lot in common. Like dandelions, anti-racism is too often thought of as an undesirable weed, but also, like dandelions, anti-racism nurtures the environment. And so I urge educators to be like dandelions, abundant, unmovable, and resilient, even and especially in this national moment where there are forces pushing against this work. During our brief time together, I'm going to clarify what anti-racist teaching is and why it's so necessary in reading instruction, and discuss some of the obstacles that threaten this work. I'll share some research that supports the work of anti-racism. I'll discuss my anti-racist reading framework and put some of those ideas into action with some modeling. So definitely we have an ambitious plan. All right, so what is anti-racism and what does anti-racism entail? Well, I can tell you this, there is no such thing as anti-racist fairy dust. There are no glittery sparkles that we can blow into the air that can magically transform society. Anti-racism is about utilizing our powers of ongoing commitment and action to identify and change oppressive policies and practices that perpetuate racist ideas, behaviors, and outcomes. And we have to be intersectional in our approach. This means we have to fully reject anti-Blackness, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, ableism, anti-Semitism, sexism, xenophobia, ageism, and any discrimination and hate toward an individual or group of people. So for any curriculum or teaching to be anti-racist, it must acknowledge the marginalization and oppression of Black and Brown people, past and present, and it must also love them. Now, there are several obstacles to this work that we have to name. I want to do this right from the top of our time together so we can then focus on the work ahead. There can be misunderstandings, as I've said, that there is no such thing as anti-racist fairy dust. That's not real. Also focusing only on representation when it comes to reading instruction is insufficient, right? Representation is important, but that alone isn't enough. Anti-racist teaching isn't work we can just sprinkle in, or as what multicultural education scholar James Banks calls, just moving it in like a holidays and heroes approach or food festivals and fun approach. And it also isn't just the one social justice unit we do that skirts around or avoids altogether discussions of systemic and institutional racism. None of that is going to be what we can call anti-racist teaching. Anti-racist teaching is a stance, and it guides how we move through the world personally and professionally. And we know that there's also resistance in addition to misunderstandings. Educators and families who are uncomfortable having conversations about race and racism, this kind of resistance centers that discomfort, and it also distracts us from the work of centering those who are most harmed by race and racism. So as educators, we have to be clear and steadfast in our intentions and in our work toward anti-racist teaching. I want to talk a little bit about the science of reading. Discussions about the science of reading have been incredibly narrow. Too often, the economic disparities between schools, where there are mostly Black and Brown students versus white students, are left out. Too often, the oppressive practices, disciplinary actions, and suspensions that are disenfranchising Black and Brown students is left out of the conversation. Too often, curriculum that is steeped in whiteness is left out of the conversation. And too often, scholarship by Black women in particular, who have been telling us and telling us and telling us about ways to teach that are inclusive and humanizing so that all children can thrive, is left out of the conversation. And I want to lift up right now the work, the beautiful work of my friend, Dr. Bettina Love. If you haven't gotten her latest book, Punish for Dreaming, you can read more about these things that I'm talking about. And her other book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. So take note of any books coming out about the teaching of reading. I want you to take note on whether or not the scholarship that has existed for decades and decades by Black and Brown educators is being applied and not just sprinkled in. Take note on whether recent scholarship by Black and Brown educators is applied in ways that causes these authors of these books about reading to change how they approach teaching and learning? Or is it just more of the same exclusive approaches to teaching wrapped in shiny new packaging? Discussions about the science of reading typically focuses on reading skills such as phonics and decoding, as if these are the only skills young readers need. So it has been challenging to locate and connect the work of culturally relevant teaching and anti-racist teaching in discussions about the science of reading. And further, to see anti-racism as an essential skill of reading. Anti-racist educators understand that the skills of reading all need to come together to support students as readers. And also, we have the issue of book banning, right? Teachers and librarians, I'm sure many of you right now here in this virtual space are navigating policies and laws that are restricting the kind of teaching and about reading and learning that is anti-racist, which is why it's so important for us to be actively involved in the work of dismantling those policies in every way that we can, by speaking to colleagues and caregivers and board members, and being present and active within our teacher unions, by reaching out to local and national leaders, by being part of the collective of people who understand the harm that is caused when we ban books and we censor in our classrooms. So take a moment to maybe just, jot down one of these reflection questions. We won't really have the time for you to actually, follow through with all of these right now, but the reflection part of this work is so important. I want you to think about these questions that you see here. Think about, have there been times when there's been a momentum for talking and teaching about race and racism in your life, at home or at school? Have these moments been reactive to local, national, or global events, or proactive, grounded in beliefs about equity? And in what ways are race and racism silenced in your school, in your personal and professional life? As you think about these questions, what patterns can you notice? And as you respond to them, right? Think and respond to them. What patterns can you notice? And what does this help you to recognize? And then I want you to do some imagining, right? And this is crucial for us as anti-racist educators. It's part of an anti-racist stance, this ongoing reflective work and reimagining. And we have to confront ourselves. James Baldwin said, the messiness of our world is more likely a reflection of the messiness of our own interior lives. And so anti-racist educators recognize that we have to reckon with our interior lives to, as Dr. Yolanda Sealy-Ruiz says, to excavate what is beneath the surface of what we do and why we do it, to interrogate this and to transform. This is our work. And avoiding this critical, necessary, ongoing work means that we run the risk of harming children. We are likely to harm children when we try to avoid this step. So it's urgent that we do this reflection work. We can do this work and should do this work individually and in community with other educators working to be anti-racist. So I want you to find colleagues and spaces to be in where this work is happening. One space that I recommend is the Institute for Racial Equity and Literacy, where each year in DC, Washington, DC, Tricia Abarvia and I, along with several expert educators, intentionally cultivate a space for this work. All right, so these Black women scholars offer classic and contemporary research on culturally relevant and anti-racist teaching, and their work has deeply influenced my own and what I'm writing about in this new book. And I want to share a little bit about their work and how I've brought their ideas together to develop an anti-racist reading framework. So Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop wrote this incredible essay, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And in the past 3 years, folks have been using this, and often without citing this woman. And they've been using this as if this is brand new. And you see the date up here, y'all, right? 1990. And so this essay has existed for decades and decades. And this shows how unfortunately long it's taking for scholarship to make its way, to be implemented into practice. And students just should not have to, and they cannot afford to wait this long. Gloria Ladson-Billings is the GOAT, right? She is the person who theorizes on culturally relevant pedagogy. I hope you got a chance to see her last Sunday, not yesterday, but the Sunday before on CBS 60 Minutes. If not, look it up. But her work is incredibly foundational and and transformational. She's the one who talks about culturally relevant pedagogy, work that is teaching that is humanizing, and that just because it's culturally relevant, it's not mutually exclusive from having high expectations and thinking about academic achievement with our students. Dr. Barbara Love, her work on what it takes for all of us to operate from a liberatory consciousness is so powerful. And she talks about once we become conscious, right? We move through the world from this waking position. You can't unsee anymore once you start to do this work. And in a few minutes, you'll notice how I've built upon her work to develop critical lenses in my anti-racist reading framework. And then there's Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz. As I said, my sister, my colleague, my friend, my mentor. Her racial literacy model shows that first, we cannot wish away racism. We cannot just jump to the top of the pyramid here that you see, which is interruption, right? We can't just jump to the top of that. We have to start with the base. And at the base is critical love. And critical love is about committing to caring for one another and the communities that we serve. So when we look across this scholarship, the through line among all of it is love. And that's why I say anti-racist teaching is about love. So there's much that we can learn from this research around the teaching of reading. And there are 5 characteristics that I want to make note of right now. There aren't only 5 characteristics of anti-racist teaching, but I believe these characteristics can take us pretty far as educators. So centering BIPOC, centering the people who are most impacted by racism in ways, centering them in ways that are affirming and spotlighting their full humanity. Recognizing cultural, community, and collective practices and powerful ways of knowing and being in the world that are steeped in these practices. Okay, shattering silences about race and racism. How? How can we be anti-racist if we don't even talk about race and racism, right? Racial literacy helps us to acquire language and analytical tools to talk about race and racism, and that means we must talk about whiteness and white supremacy. And when we think about who we'd like our students to emulate in the world, we should be beginning that work by learning about the people in their own communities who are working for racial justice. It doesn't mean we're not going to teach about the folks who are written about in books, but how can we be more tied and connected to the community? These are things that we want to concern ourselves around. And then there are these critical lenses that are going to help us to select books, to center, help books that we're centering in curriculum, to plan reading instruction, to facilitate discussions with students, and to support students in having conversations with each other. And so these 6 critical lenses, you can start to see Dr. Barbara Love's influence coming in, are awareness, right? How are we making sure that, again, those who are most impacted by racism are recognized, valued, and loved? How are we making sure that's happening in our reading instruction when we're reading about characters of color and people of color? And of course, the students right in our own classroom. Awareness. What is the work we're doing to raise students' critical consciousness? Who writes the story always matters. There, if we had time, we could talk about all of the research that shows this. So you'll see me modeling with own voices texts. These are texts that are written by authors who share the same or similar racial, cultural identity as the characters or people they're writing about, and they're able to write with a greater nuance and care. Atmosphere, we want to be thinking about how are Black and Brown people being positioned in the books that we're centering? What is the context? We want to think about activism. What can we help kids think about in terms of what they might be invited to do after they've learned from the reading that they've just experienced? And accountability, right? How we want students to have time to reflect on how they're being challenged and changed. So these overlapping and interconnected characteristics and critical lenses work together to become an anti-racist reading framework that offers a powerful vision for teaching and learning for liberation. So, also part of discussions around the science of reading is knowledge building. Anti-racist educators understand that these discussions are not neutral. And I want to lift up the work right now of Dr. Richard Milner IV, who is developing a disruptive framework in response to conversations about the science of reading that's disregarding the knowledges of Black and Brown people. So the anti-racist reading framework I propose is an opportunity for educators and students to use those critical lenses to explore questions like who builds knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and why is knowledge constructed, and to address those questions in ways that are inclusive and anti-racist. So let's practice applying this framework. We'll focus on centering BIPOC. Now here's why centering Black, Indigenous, people of color matters. Let's take a look at the findings of a 2023 study by EdTrust around who is centered in reading curriculums and who is not. So this was analysis of texts and curriculums in P through 12 practices, so primary grades through all the way up through 12th grade. And you can see here listed under the findings, in 2023, we are still seeing much of the same. And so as Dr. Bishop stated back in 1990, white children have always found their mirrors. And the data and the research shows this hasn't changed, not enough. And the Cooperative Children's Book Center's research over the past several years continues to show the data around children's books being published, exposing the challenges that racialized and minoritized children continue to navigate in terms of book access. So this struggle continues. Centering BIPOC in reading instruction, by the way, does not mean that we are ignoring white children. It's about recognizing the longevity and the magnitude of invisibility and erasure of Black and Brown people in books and curriculum, and course correcting, right? In affirming, humanizing ways, and understanding that all children, including white children, need to see Black and brownness affirmed in a world that too often tries to tell them otherwise and does otherwise, in order to avoid, as Dr. Bishop says, an exaggerated sense of their own importance and value in the world, a dangerous ethnocentrism. So let's practice with this text. Let me know in the chat if you know this one. This is I Am Golden, and it's written by Eva Chen and illustrated by Sophia Dial. And while I'm focusing on one characteristic of anti-racist teaching, which is centering BIPOC, you see it highlighted here in this circle, please note that it can never be separated from the others. Even when thinking specifically about one, aspects of the others are always present. And that's a good thing, right? Because this work is not linear, it's circuitous, and it's interconnected. So as I switch to my document camera, I want you to imagine that you are a classroom of, let's say fourth graders. And I'll be providing some prompts for you Switching right now. I'll be providing some prompts for you to discuss, and I want to encourage you to share your thinking in the chat. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to be going much faster than I would if I were actually in a classroom with, let's say, fourth graders. Some of the time I'm going to be imagining what you're saying as there's a little bit of a delay with getting your responses. So in other words, I'm going to keep it moving. But again, I would be moving much more slowly and intentionally in a classroom with children. All right, so here we go. Readers, I'm going to be reading a picture book called I Am Golden. It's written by Eva Chen and Sophie Dial. It's about a girl named May who learns to love herself exactly as she is. All year, readers, we've been talking about the word identity. Our identity is what makes us each unique. Identity, we know, includes things we can tell by looking at each other, such as our skin color, our hair texture, our facial features, our body shapes. And also, our identity includes things we can't just know by looking at each other, such as the languages we speak, who we love, where we live, religions we celebrate, and also race and gender. People often believe they can tell someone's race or gender just by looking at them, but in many cases, they can be wrong. Specifically, when it comes to race and gender, one thing we can do as readers is to wait until characters or people, if we're reading nonfiction, tell us who they are. So I want us to read this book and think about identity, our own and that of the characters. So let's get started. Let's listen for what we're learning about our characters. What are we learning about May's identity? And what are we learning about May's parents? All right, let's get started. Okay, we named you May, not May like the month, May, which means beautiful, like the country we live in now, Megwa, America. What do you see when you look in the mirror, May? Do you see beauty? We see eyes that point toward the sun, that give us the warmth and joy of 1,000 rays when you smile. We see hair as inky black and smooth as a peaceful night sky. We see skin brushed with gold. Okay, readers, what are we learning about May? What are we learning about May's identity? And what are we learning about May's parents? Go ahead and share your thinking with each other. And colleagues, you can put your ideas in the chat. I'm going to spend some time looking at what you're doing. Okay, yeah. So we're learning about her name. She has black hair and golden skin. Her parents are immigrants, right? They think she's beautiful. Yeah, some of you are noticing and saying that May's name means beautiful, and you're noticing Chinese words like Mei Gua. Some of you are saying that May's parents love their daughter and they tell her that she's beautiful. We each bring our full selves to every text that we read, and this includes our racial and cultural identity. As we continue to read and learn more about the characters, will you be thinking especially about how this text might be a mirror for you, reflecting parts of your identity in ways that feel powerful? Think about how this text might be a window for you, helping you to look out into the world and learn about lives and experiences different from your own, and also think about how it might be both. All right. So let's keep reading, and we will think about mirrors, windows, and both. And I want to challenge you that even if you are not Chinese, right? If you are not a girl, think about how this text could still be a mirror for you. All right, so let's keep going. We see the hopes and dreams of your ancestors when we look at you. We journeyed into the unknown to give you a new path to trailblaze. In this upside down world, clever child, you have become our teacher and translator. All right, let's pause here and tell me how this text might be a mirror for you, a window for you, or maybe both, and anything else we're learning about May's identity and May's parents. Wow, some of you are saying this text is a mirror for you because your parents tell you you're beautiful, right? Some of you saying this is a window for you because May's parents are immigrants and you're wondering, what that must be like to move to a new country, right? Um, and some of you are saying that your family members, your caregivers help you to see yourself in ways that are powerful. So we're going to continue this work. Let's keep thinking and trying to understand what we're learning about May's identity and how this text could be a mirror for us, a window for us, or both. And can we also think about what seems to threaten May's positive sense of self, right? What might get in the way of May's positive sense of self, the way of her seeing herself the way that her parents do? Let's be on the lookout for that. Our words won't always be enough to comfort you, and we won't be able to be with you every step of the way. We know you feel alone sometimes. People tell you that you're different, and you can't be one of them. But we promise there is power in being different. Are you ready, brave May, to hear about your secret power? You are never alone. You carry a golden flame inside you, and it's always with you. Wow. Readers, let's stop here. What are you thinking about? What could get in the way of May's positive sense of herself? What are you noticing here? What are you wondering here? What could stop May from feeling positive about herself? I think you're noticing that May is smart and responsible, and May has helped her parents navigate living in America by translating between English and Chinese, and also teaching her parents about the country. And you're noticing that May is experiencing some bullying, right? Some of you said that she's being called different and she's being treated differently. And this could threaten May's positive sense of self. You're also noticing some things about May's parents that their motivation seems to be to make sure that their child's self-esteem isn't broken, because our family, right, our caregivers, and the ways we see ourselves and the way the world sees us shapes our identity. And I want to share some other language with you as we are continuing to think about identity. I want to share some more language with you. This is a word that might be unfamiliar to you, and it is microaggression. And there are a few kinds of microaggressions that we can be on the lookout for as readers. And we can also think about how these might be coming up in our own lives. So anytime you see like the use of or hear the use of a racial slur or a symbol, like an offensive racial name calling or a swastika or a Confederate flag, that's called a micro assault. And micro insults, these are the subtle verbal and nonverbal communications that come from racist stereotypes, like saying to someone who's Black and tall, oh, you must play basketball, or saying to someone whose racial identity you don't think you can point to right away. But remember, we said you can't always tell someone's race by looking at them. But in those circumstances, someone might ask, where are you from? Assuming that they're not from the place that you're from. And a micro invalidation, right, is an exclusionary comment, like the one that I just gave you. Where are you from? No, where are you really from, right? So tell your partner if you have heard microaggressions like these, if you've experienced a microaggression, if you've seen a microaggression. Tell your partner if this has come up for you in your life in any way. Yeah. Yeah. So some of you are saying you've experienced it, you've seen it, you've heard it. And I want us to consider another word. And that word is this. It is resistance. May's parents helps her understand her racial and cultural identity and to cultivate a sense of self-love and to help May resist racial microaggressions. So let's finish the story now and be on the lookout for microaggressions or any other social issues that we're noticing. And let's also think more about resistance and the importance of self-love. Since we're going to be reading for a longer stretch of time, it can be helpful to jot your ideas down on a Post-it or in your notes. All right, colleagues. So for the purposes of time, we're not going to finish this incredible book, but I do hope if you don't know it and if you don't have it, that you have added it to your list of your cart, your shopping cart at wherever it is that you purchase books. So let's talk about what you noticed me doing during this read aloud and the ways that I was working to address those critical lenses. I'm going to pull back up the presentation right now. One moment. One moment. All right, here we go. So in the chat, feel free to, talk about any of the framework, the critical lenses that you noticed me addressing in that read aloud. Just go ahead and share your thinking about what you noticed, what you saw as you think about this framework and me putting it in action. What are some of the critical lenses that came up for you? If you could just put it in the chat, we'll talk through it. Yeah. Yeah, having sticky notes and being able to use them. I got to tell you, this has only happened to me one time. I went into a school and I wasn't doing this. I think I was doing a book. It might have been I Am Every Good Thing, like the one behind me on the shelf by Derek Barnes. And a teacher was so frustrated with me because I had these Post-its and I was introducing, this word, or it might have been, gentrification. It could have been that word. It might have been a different book. Don't quote me on this. And the teacher was like, well, I could never do that. I would have to do all this pre-vocabulary teaching work before we even, days before we got to the book. I would have to have the kids define it and use it in sentences. And I thought, oh my goodness, oh wow, you have such low expectations for your kids. Of course, you can introduce a word to them that might be unfamiliar to them. And while this might be the first time kids are seeing a word like microaggression or gentrification, it shouldn't be the last time. And of course, kids can can grab onto vocabulary, new vocabulary as they're reading without you stopping to do like a pre-vocabulary lesson. So I see in the chat, a lot of you are talking about awareness. Yes, that would be me introducing microaggression as a specific type of bullying that's racial, right? You saw awareness about parents making sure their child was feeling loved and important in the world, right? So here are the kinds of prompts that, I was thinking about with this book that you can be thinking about with other books, right? Of affirmation. What are we learning about the characters, right? And you heard me ask, what are we learning about May's identity and awareness, right? What might prevent May from seeing herself the way her parents do? What are you learning about racial microaggressions and how they impact people's lives? So if I continue to read the rest of this book, we would do more conversation, have more conversations around that. Authorship, again, continuing to read this book, we'd want to talk about who is the author and who's the illustrator and how do their identities influence this work. And in the back of this book is a really powerful author's note that really helps us to think more deeply about the reading. You could even do that on a next day. Everything doesn't have to happen in the one reading, right? Atmosphere, how does this text reflect the identities and lived experiences of the characters and people? How does it reflect your own? So you saw me drawing on Dr. Bishop's scholarship around mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Activism, right? Again, I didn't finish the book, but thinking about questions like, how does this book help you to understand the difference between bullying and racism? And what can you do to interrupt racism and anti-Asian hate when you see it in action at your school and in your daily life, right? Asking kids to really think about how the actions they take every day makes a difference. That activists aren't just the famous people written about in books, but they're the people sitting right here in this classroom. And also accountability, right? Thinking about how this book will influence your thinking and actions now and in the future, right? This book will go back on the shelf, but how are you changed because of this reading? How is this text an invitation for us to think deeply and differently, possibly differently, about and ask kids to name that? And to apply this in my life, when and how, ask them to name that. They can do this work in their reader's notebook. And educators, I want to tell you, be prepared to be wowed by what children will say, right? If only we listened to them. So this work is not just for read alouds. I want to say that. Educators can coach kids using this framework during independent reading, in book clubs, in reading partnerships, in small groups, in instructional lessons. And because reflection and accountability isn't just important for our students, but it is critical for us as teachers, I am inviting you also to think about each of the books you're using in your classrooms and with your students, and to think about how is your thinking changing, and how is this book challenging you to make radical changes in your personal and in your professional life, right? Because we can't pretend to come to school between 8 and 3 and be the anti-racist teacher and then drive away back into our own lives. And those lives are isolated from the work you say you care about and do. There has to be changes in both places. So the purpose of reading is not simply sounding out letters and words and answering comprehension questions. We know that reading is more than this. And how do we know? We can look across history. We can think critically about why enslavers prevented and punished Black people from reading. And we can look at the present. We can look at right now, where we have people and forces working hard to keep certain curriculum, books, out of classrooms, libraries, and schools. In teaching to transgress, bell hooks frames the purpose of education as the practice of freedom. And I will say that reading is liberation. So again, this work can be done not only in read alouds, but as students read individually, in partnerships and book clubs. And in Anti-Racist Reading Revolution, I've created these toolkits of critical lenses that can help educators and students sustain the revolution for reading as a practice of freedom. So, Anti-Racist Reading Revolution emerges from an experience I had back in 2021. After I adapted Stamped for Kids, Jason Reynolds and we were doing virtual, book tours, right? Because we're still right in the heart of the pandemic. And so we did a virtual tour with a school, and the whole night was designed as a Q&A with students. And they were mostly, I would say, middle and high school students. And the first question of the night was from a young Black student. Her name was Zoe. And she asked, when can we move beyond representation to liberation? And it was the first question of the night. And at the time, and in that moment, I did not have a sufficient response to her beautiful, audacious question. As I said, it was the pandemic. My father had been struck by COVID and was navigating illness and recovery. Stand for Kids had just come out, and everything was feeling very overwhelming. But Zoe was right. Representation is important, but it is not enough. It alone is not enough. And I hope our brief time together and this book helps to answer Zoe's question. Because if we want young people to be able to show up as their full selves, to feel whole, to feel seen, to feel loved, and to develop the skills needed to recognize, confront, and dismantle racism, and to embrace anti-racism, to embrace love, then this will require all of us to refuse to allow anyone to dismiss this work as weeds, to instead be dandelions, abundant, unmovable, and resilient. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to check in the chat right now for any questions that folks may have that I can answer. We have a little bit of time to address this. And I don't know, are there questions? Please put them in the chat. I love an active chat. So thank you so much for being here and for being so participatory, for being an active participant in this work. All right, so let me see. Yeah, a lot of, how do you address the colleagues who are afraid of this work? Yeah, that is the question, Carol, right? I think we need to get to the root of the problem. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own discomfort? Are we afraid of confronting that what we thought we've always known is possibly, problematic and wrong? Are we afraid of parents and caregivers? Like, I think we need to isolate that and try to deal with things one at a time. That's what I try to do in my work in schools when people are reacting to this work in a way that, it's not easy to know where it's coming from, is to try to figure out where it's coming from and then to address it one at a time, right? To also put yourself in there, right? I try to always, as I've done in this book, I put myself in here and talk about the things that I've done in my practice that I wish I could go back and redo. I, talk about, the things that I'm still learning. Right now, I'm doing an institute with my good friend Colleen Cruz, who I think is here tonight. Um, teach Latinx history all year. And I can't tell you how much I'm learning because there's not a number big enough to represent how much I am learning as I'm researching and thinking about all that I don't know about Latina heritage and history. So we have to humble ourselves. And if you can do that before your colleagues, perhaps they are more willing to humble themselves too. Excuse me. Let me see if there's another question here. Can you please speak to the ways that you respond to folks who say that talking about racism with kindergarten children is too early? Oh, yes. I would say that that is a privilege, right? Because, many Black and Brown children already, have had conversations about race at home. They have not had the opportunity, the luxury, the privilege of waiting, right? My own daughter came home from nursery school one day, and at bath time, she said, "Mommy, why am I brown all over?" in a way that let me know that something absolutely happened in preschool that day. And sure enough, she was told she couldn't play in the kitchen area because she was brown all over. Young children absolutely see skin color unless they have the medical condition, right, of color blindness. You cannot pretend that we don't come all in beautiful shades. And so they're not too young to have that conversation. There are tons of research that show that kids as early as, like 8 months old recognize racial differences. So when we delay having that conversation, we run the risk of them taking what they can glean from the environment, which we know is a bunch of racist smog, to come up with their own answers, right? So what we can be doing with our youngest learners is absolutely affirming that we come in an array of different skin tones and talking about melanin, right? These are words that kindergartens can say, because kindergartners can say, as I like to say, if your child can say Tyrannosaurus Rex, they can say melanin. And we can teach them about the science of skin and why we come in all these beautiful shades. That's where we want to begin, right? And then we can absolutely talk about the unfairness of people who have ideas about others based on skin color. And we want to make sure we're not positioning it as, that these harmful things are happening because someone has Black skin, for example. That's not the reason. Too often we hear that, oh, these terrible things were happening because this person was Black or this person was insert another racial group. No, that helps children to understand wrongly that there's something wrong with being Black or Asian American or Latina. These things are happening because some people have racist ideas. So in all these different ways, we can have conversations with kids that are really important and meaningful about race. Do you have any suggestions for adapting these approaches for older students? I teach high school. Yes. So I model in Antiracist Reading Revolution mostly with picture books, but there are some chapter books in there. And I also include for educators, I make recommendations of books that high school educators could use, middle school educators could use. And I also want to emphasize that picture books are for everyone, right? I want to say this again, picture books are for everyone, regardless of age. I remember when I was getting my master's degree, I had a professor who would begin class by reading aloud, and it was always from a picture book. And you should see how these grown people, myself included, would race to get to school on time. So we did not miss our professor's read aloud. So I think, obviously you can't just only read picture books with kids in any grade, right? Middle schoolers or high schoolers and middle grade readers in elementary school. But certainly this work can be replicated with longer books is the point I'm trying to make. All right. Is there another question that I missed? I'm just looking to see. Pre-K is a question mark. I'm not sure what the question is, though. Can you do this in pre-K? Maybe? Yes, absolutely. You can use books like Bell Hook's Skin Again, which is in my book. I do an analysis of that book that you could use with children. You could use Our Skin, a child's story. It's by, oh, what is her name? Our Skin, and then there's like a colon and there's like a subtitle, and I'm drawing a blank. If people know that one, please fill it in. But I also include, yes, Megan Madison. Thank you, Kirsten. Hey, Kirsten. So yeah, you can absolutely do this work with pre-K, and we should. All right. Okay, so there's some things in the chat I have to go back and find. All right, so I think, unless I've missed a question, I think we're all set. So again, I want to thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you again, Sonja, for today's presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.